All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Mindgasms podcast. Gonna talk with Tim Keefe again today. Drew Sample was perhaps going to be here, and he might still show up, but probably still gonna, probably just gonna be me and Tim, and we're gonna go through postmodernism and ethics. So the postmodern theory on ethics, based on one of those other essays from the Cambridge Companion to Postmodernism that we've been doing a series on. So, yeah, as usual, you can start us off if you want to there, Tim.
Alrighty. So for the listening audience, you'll be pleased to know is that we're almost at the end of the Cambridge Companion.
Yeah, only one more part after this, right?
Yeah, one or two, depending if we want to do law.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
we can do that.
yeah, we could do that. But we're near the end, so you won't have to listen to us blather on about this for too much longer. Then we can start on the Cambridge Companion to Postmodern Theology.
Yeah. Shane Kennedy will be excited about that one.
That's right. I think we should definitely include him into all those essays.
Mm-hmm.
He
Yeah,
would have much to say.
yeah.
All right, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and turn to our. Just want to make sure my phone is silent. Okay, so let's go to this is essay number 9 on page 182 of the Cambridge Companion. This is Postmodernism and Ethics Against the Metaphysics of Comprehension by Robert Eaglestone. Okay. So I think this will be an interesting one when we're talking about ethics. To give a side note, so I've mentioned Zygmunt Bauman, who is my postmodern hero, for sure.
One of mine too.
Yes, and he has talked about ethics within the context of postmodernity, liquid modernity. And in fact, one of his earlier books from the 90s, when he really started to get into postmodernism, is entitled Postmodern Ethics. And it's quite a good book. It's a hard one to find. Haven't been able to find it on PDF, but you could find a used copy through Amazon or
Oh,
find it in
okay.
an academic library. We won't get into this now. That might be a subject for a future podcast. But this essay is probably one of the shorter ones in the collection. And we're going to discuss Emmanuel Levinas in particular. But before we get there, let's go ahead and dig into the essay. All right, so starting on the first page, page 182, Eaglestone says, postmodern ethics is often described in vague terms such as openness, otherness, and fracture, and an opposition to totalizing systems. In this chapter, I aim to explain in one way why these terms are vague and why they have come to mean so much for postmodern thought. I also argue that postmodernism is first an ethical position before anything else. And then he quotes Mary Midgley, who was a well-known British philosopher. Midgley says, quote, the strong unifying tendency that is natural to our thought keeps making us hope that we have found a single pattern which is a theory of everything, a key to all the mysteries, the secret of the universe. A long series of failures has shown that this can't work. That realization seems to be the sensible element at the core of the conceptual muddle now known as postmodernism. Okay, so we'll stop there. So, Andrew, we've covered many different essays in this companion here. So, would you say that Midgley's characterization of postmodernism is fairly correct?
That the position of that it doesn't work as an ethical system.
Well, no, she's saying that we as human beings are trying to find a theory of everything.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh, yeah. That totally makes sense. Yeah.
right.
What they said there, what she said there about it being first and foremost an ethical theory, that kind of turns postmodernism on its head for me. Because to me, it seems like most of what I learned so far is that it's not, at least it's not trying to present itself as an ethical theory.
Right. But also is not a totalizing theory.
Yeah,
You know,
for sure.
we go all the way back to Lyotard. What is the one of the main statements that Lyotard gives in the postmodern condition? The incredulity against grand narratives.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, for sure.
So we are not talking about a theory of everything here, that's for sure. We are also not really talking necessarily about postmodernism as a collection or a comprehensive or a coherent body of thought. We've seen many different approaches here. Performance, art, space, science and technology, what we covered the last time. And then we're going to get to religion very soon. Now we're focusing on ethics. So in ethics, there are definitely some peculiarities that you don't find elsewhere else. So continuing on with Eagleston, he says, quote, postmodernism is not a response to failures of Western thought, but perhaps horrified to its successes. Postmodernism, implicitly or explicitly, is about ethics before it is anything else. He said this on the first page. Before it is a style in art and architecture, before it is a description of an era, such as late capitalist or post-industrial or globalized or post-colonial, before it is a philosophical movement, however vaguely defined, as post-structuralism or as nomadic, before it names a situation of knowledge, incredulity by meta-narrative, say, it is concerned with ethics. It is an ethical system, it is an ethical response to exactly the idea of a single pattern that characterizes Western thought and the activity that stems from that single pattern. Okay, so Eaglestone is taking an ethical approach here. This is what postmodernism is.
Mm-hmm.
All right, continuing on, and then to the next page, page 184, he says, quote, postmodernism, whatever it is understood to be, does not offer a new system of ethics or explicitly endorse older ethical systems based on duty or on virtue or on use and ends. Rather, in prying through these explanatory systems, it can be seen as an attempt to respond to the, quote, primordial ethical experience that underlies, quote, the construction of a system or procedure for formulating and testing the moral acceptability of certain maxims or judgments in relation to social action and civic duty, end quote. This is because postmodernism, first, the disruption of the metaphysics of comprehension, which is the gesture that characterizes Western thought. This disruption stems from an encounter with otherness. Okay, so let me read the last portion, which is in italics. The disruption of the metaphysics of comprehension, which is the gesture that characterizes Western thought. This disruption stems from an encounter with otherness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I like that. That helps kind of explain what I brought up earlier. It's disrupting like the Western conception of ethics with otherness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, exactly is meant by otherness in that context?
So you see this in, you could say, postmodern thought, but you could also see it elsewhere in like continental philosophy. You'd most definitely find it. So the other is the big O. This is somebody that is radically distinct from myself as the subject. If you want to take a slightly dualistic approach, the subject and the object. As a subject, as a conscious subject, I kind of know myself. I kind of know what I am. And I relate myself, this is where some individuality comes in relation to others that are not like me. Okay. However, implicit in that is an understanding is that others are not really that different from me. You know, we're all Canadians, we're all Americans, we're all white males, or whatever it is. You know, something that is a characteristic of an identity where we share common characteristics.
Right.
In the case of the big O, the big other, this is something that is radically different from the subject and maybe other subjects here. In fact, you know, this ties in with the metaphysics of comprehension. Eagleston says later on, the metaphysics of comprehension is a way of describing how Western thought works. To comprehend means two things: to understand and to take hold. And to do one involves, to a lesser or greater extent, the other. They are unavoidably intertwined. Okay. So going back to my earlier point is that although there is this subject-object dichotomy, others is distinct from the subject is not radically distinct. So there is the comprehension. I can comprehend who you are. I can understand who you are. However, with the big otherness, I can't do that.
Right. Yeah,
And
that makes
this
sense.
is what postmodernism is ushering in, is that it is placing more of a stress now on the big other as the incomprehensible.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. That makes sense. Like this idea of otherness and that, there can be individual differences, but you're not necessarily that different from each other. I mean, this reminds me of what a lot of what we've talked about so far in terms of postmodernism. Like I've read Foucault talking about similar things, and this reminds me of Deleuze in
Mhm.
particular, like his philosophy of difference. Like you need to define yourself as an individual by comparing yourself to something else, or you need to define an object by comparing it to something else.
Right, but also remember there's a certain thread of comprehension that exists here.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Just like we when we looked at the Leibniz essay in Deleuze, is that the difference is one of degree. It's not a
Yeah,
radical difference. So there is
yeah,
some kind of
yeah.
comprehension that still exists here. In this case, it is incomprehensible.
Okay.
Okay, I can give a science fiction analogy because I was watching. I do recommend you see and the listeners to see the movie Solaris, or maybe get a hold of the original novel from the '60s by Stanislav Lem. So the Solaris is a science fiction story, and it is about a psychologist, Chris Kelvin, who travels to a planet that is covered by an ocean that is actually a sentient alien intelligence. Covers the planet. And there's all kinds of interesting plot twists, which I'm not going to go into. But the purpose that Lem did, the themes that Lem is trying to underscore within the novel is that Solaris is a radically other entity. It's
Hmm.
incomprehensible, it's indescribable, it's inscrutable to the human beings that are there. And he's underscoring the fact is that unlike what you had seen in science fiction prior to the time he wrote the novel, this was many years ago, that there's some kind of anthropomorphic quality to the aliens, or that they have thoughts and feelings that are
Yeah,
somewhat similar to us, or that their motivations are somewhat similar to us, but not in this case. With
yeah.
Solaris, the planet, or the alien intelligence, it's just completely unscrutable. So this is an example in a science fiction novel of a radical other.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I haven't seen that movie or read the book, but I definitely want to check them out. It sort of reminds me of to a slightly lesser extent, but um Polish Christian Bale or Mache, who we've talked with, one of his favorite science fiction movies that he mentioned recently is Arrival, that came
Okay.
out. I think it was last year or the year before. It's a pretty new
Hmm.
science fiction movie in which basically aliens come to Earth, but
Hmm.
they have so much trouble communicating with the humans because they go into a ship to find the aliens, and the way they have to communicate with the aliens is the aliens are behind a glass that they put up themselves in their own ship,
Hmm.
and the aliens, they're not anthropomorphic at all. They kind of looks like they're giant tree trunks, but like they have like lizard skin or something like that, and
Hmm.
they communicate by making like mist on the glass with these random symbols. And then eventually, if you understand their language well enough, they communicate with you telepathically.
Hmm.
So it's like a really in some ways a probably much more realistic conception of atheists or of aliens than the one that we often see. Like it's not to the same extent as your example, though. Like I said,
Right. Again, in Lem and Solaris, his point is that why should we assume that an alien intelligence is understandable to us?
yeah,
Yeah. So that again, as I said, that's a good science fiction example of a radical other. And this
okay,
is disrupting the metaphysics of comprehension. Now, I think I've seen clips of Arrival. It's an interesting story, but also the difference there is that eventually, because it's a woman that's a linguist and she cracks the code, So eventually she attains comprehension of what the aliens are trying to say, whereas beforehand, they were inscrutable.
Yeah.
Couldn't comprehend what it was. However, in Solaris, no such thing happens.
Okay.
Okay. But anyways, the point is the disruption of the metaphysics of comprehension, and this is an encounter with otherness.
Okay. So
Okay.
so what they're saying then is that like this example of Solaris that you brought up, that's similar to reality in terms of ethics, the otherness.
Well, we'll get to that with
Okay.
Levinas. So
Okay.
we'll go ahead and say, let's go ahead and dive into Levinas because we'll get to this point. Okay, so Levinas is an important philosopher and continental philosopher. He was a contemporary of Heidegger, actually was a student of Husserl and Heidegger in Germany, even though he is French, Jewish too. And he was very much operating in the phenomenological vein in the early part of the 20th century. He was a French POW during World War II. All of his wife's family was murdered in the concentration camp. And then he, for the rest of his life, held different chairs of philosophy within France. And so he is best known for two works, Totality and Infinity, and Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence. Okay. And he was a major influence on figures like Derrida, Lyotard, and some French philosophers. Okay. So one of Derrida's early essays is Violence and Metaphysics, for example. Okay. So that's the brief bio. Let's go ahead and jump into philosophy. This is on page 185 of Eaglestone's essay, the section Omnivorous Philosophy. Okay. So Eaglestone says, quote, Levinas, responding to Heidegger and to the whole tradition of Western philosophy, offers a way of seeing how what I have called the metaphysics of comprehension work. Let us, in a version of Hegel's master-slave dialect, take two existence. Existence, that which exists, but before being understood as members of a genus, a class, or even understood as a thing. One, the knower, and two, that which is to be known, separate from the knower, the other. What happens when they encounter each other? The knower encounters the known as an other to itself, in such a way that respects its otherness, and without marking it in any way by this cogitative relation. But at the same time, and more importantly in this context, the knower, and here the knower is one from the West, steeped in the, quote, logos of being, which is a Levinas phrase, cannot but comprehend the known. This comprehension strips the known existent of its otherness because of the way it works. Comprehension works by understanding, by grasping the known existent through a third neutral term. This third term may be thought, in which case the particular known existent becomes not a concrete particular, but an abstract general. It may be sensation, in which the objective quality and the subjective affection are merged. Or most significantly, this third term may be being, capital B. For Levinas, Heidegger's work is perhaps the strongest restatement of Western thought, and so becomes both his major exemplar and opponent. Heidegger takes the experience of being, often ignored by previous philosophers, as the grounding for thought, ontology. Western philosophy, Levinas writes, has most often been an ontology, a reduction of the other to the same by interposition of a middle and neutral term that ensures the comprehension of being, small b. So it is that being is the light in which existence become intelligible, become a concept. The, quote, relation with being that is enacted as ontology consists in neutralizing the existent in order to comprehend or grasp it. An existent comes to be comprehended because it stands in relation to me, and is understood as that standing in relation to me, not as itself. If I understand myself as a being who has being, capital B, already reflectively but unreflective, already an implicit philosophy absorbed with my mother's milk, ideas are at their most powerful when we do not recognize that they are there. I am led to believe that any other existent must have being as I do, and is in this key way at least, the same as me. End quote. Okay.
Okay.
So, a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I like this reference to Heidegger on being, and it's good that we already went through that, because it helps me understand it a little better. And so is one part of what they're saying there, that so thoughts create these distinctions, these specific distinctions that we see, like they make these general and loose distinctions more specific, just basically with our language, so they're not necessarily really there. And then also that well, at the end there, at least, that any 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 conscious creature that exists. Well, actually, no. I'm a little confused about what the point about being is actually in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, a couple different things here. Number one is, which we've seen this kind of thing before. We've discussed this before, which is the knower, in taking an existent, and this is a term that Levinas uses, an existent versus existence, something else. So if we have an apple before us, the apple sitting on my desk, prior to any kind of thought about it, any kind of description about it, any kind of reference to it, it is an existence. It is an existent, something that exists. Okay.
Okay.
When you apply understanding to it, then this is where earlier in the paragraph we're saying a genus, a class, or even understood as a being. Okay, so the apple is a Granny Smith apple that is fresh plucked from the tree, not a rotting apple. That it has a certain size relative to something else. Okay, now we're starting to classify it. And if we refer to it as a being, we're also classifying it. Okay. So
Okay.
what I think that Levinas is doing here too is that he's also trying to do a runaround phenomenology. I think I've mentioned phenomenology here and there. This is something that phenomenology attempted to do, particularly in Husserl's formulation, which is going back to the thing itself prior to any kind of a description or classification, conceptualization of it. You allow it to exist, and not just in perception, but in consciousness. Okay, I am conscious of this object, this existent in my consciousness before I even do anything with it, classify it. But Levinas also
Okay.
moved beyond phenomenology, as did Heidegger, because of phenomenology's limitations.
Right.
Okay, follow my
So
argument so far?
yeah. So I think so. So is it the this point, sort of, that if you try to describe something other than that it exists, you
Hmm.
can't, like, it becomes incomprehensible unless you do something other than trying to classify it or compare it to something else?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. I mean, it's almost inescapable that when you pick up an object, there are many different objects in your place. For example, you're in the kitchen. You can
Mhm.
choose anything. You pick up that object and you're aware of that object. You hold it in your hand, you see it, you rotate it around, throw it in the air, it falls back down. You are aware of this object. Okay. As soon as you describe what it is, then you've put up a distance between yourself and that object.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So this is going back to what I was saying about the metaphysics of comprehension. I have now let's say that, for example, you pick up one of your cups. Okay, it's a red cup. So you have an existent, using Levinas's term. As soon as you describe it as a cup, you've comprehended it. You're trying to comprehend what it is. You're understanding it, you're grasping it, and through a third neutral term. And this is a thought. You've already thought, making the statement, this is a red cup in my hand.
Mhm.
Okay? Make sense?
And so part of that is that our, like, the way we define things is based on our thoughts and how we decide to define them? Or am I just implying that?
Well, again, this is what Eagleson is saying in the essay. His comprehension works by understanding, by grasping the known existent through a third neutral term. This third term may be thought.
Okay.
Okay. Now, with Heidegger, Levinas was very much influenced by Heidegger, but he took issue with Heidegger and being, capital B. Why? It's because being then becomes that third term in Levinas's view. Also, Eagleson makes reference to this, Western philosophy has always been some kind of an ontology. Okay, and then what Heidegger is trying to do in his philosophy is prioritize ontology, getting away from how Western philosophy took an ill-fated turn, starting in the modern era with Descartes.
So wait, so does Husserl mean when he's talking about Heidegger that
Husserl or
that
Levinas?
Levinas, sorry, that that being is thought, but by what you said, the third option?
No, being is not thought, but you can think of being
Okay,
as this kind of category. Now,
right.
you kind of can see where Levinas is going here. Heidegger, at least in Levinas's opinion, what Heidegger is doing is that he trips himself up by focusing on being as this inscrutable category, we'll say. You can even shift back to what we covered with in the delusional podcast about Duns Scotus, okay,
Mm-hmm.
the univocity of being. So there is being, and it applies to many different categories. You do not make a distinction like Aquinas does between existence and essence. Okay. However, you are still acknowledging, and you could even use Aquinian term, making an ontological commitment of something. But this being thing is problematic for Heidegger and Levinas's view. Okay.
Okay.
So now going back to what Eagleson says here. So it is that, quote, being is the light in which existence become intelligible. And as a matter of fact, there is a term related to this that Heidegger used called the clearing. In German, die Lichtung, which is the clearing is like if you're in a forest and suddenly you come upon a space that has no trees. This is a clearing.
Mm-hmm.
So the clearing is where the beings, small b, the ontic beings, emerge and where they become intelligible. That's what the clearing is. And being is that clearing.
Okay.
Okay. Again, this is one of those things where you just got to sit with it.
So I'm still slightly confused then about what Levinas's problem with Heidegger's conception of being is exactly. Like I know you said he thinks that it's this indescribable category, but I guess I don't see not that I'm trying to defend Heidegger or anything like that, but I don't see how what exactly his criticism is.
Okay, so his main beef is Heidegger prioritizes ontology,
Okay.
whereas Levinas is going to prioritize ethics.
Okay.
And ethics and ontology are not the same thing.
Yes, of course. Okay.
Okay, so that's the main beef, if you could summarize it in one sentence.
Okay.
So pressing on, let's see. Just come personal. Okay. All right. So Eagleson says, quote, and this is referencing on Levinas. The work of ontology, then, consists in apprehending the individual, which alone exists, not in its individuality, but in its generality, of which alone there is a science. The relation with the other is here accomplished only through a third term which I find in myself. Philosophy is an egoology. For Levinas, this is tied in with an understanding of freedom, not straightforwardly here political freedom. Ontology, the comprehension of the other by the same, promotes freedom, because otherness, totally consumed and mediated by the third term, does not impede the subject. If there is nothing outside me, I am totally free and without limits. But the assumption that there is nothing outside me, nothing other, stems from the form of Western thought as ontology that takes the I as its starting point. Freedom rooted in the I opposes that justice that takes the other person as the starting point. And this is the clearest in, well, we can go ahead and skip that. So once a philosophy of being, capital B, has established itself, implicitly or explicitly, an existent can appear only in or as a part of that philosophy. This means that the I thinks that it is not delimited in any way as everything it knows is part of itself. It is totally free. Knowledge is freedom. Moreover, this leads to what Levinas calls the, quote, thematization and conceptualization of the other. That is the, quote, or suppression or possession of the other, capital O. This means that Western thought, which begins with, or always has been, despite forgetting it, ontology is a, quote, philosophy of power, a philosophy of injustice.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Yeah, I like that point about criticizing the Western conception of ontology as it being based on the individual. That's interesting. Yeah.
Right. So going back to the earlier points, we're accepting a subject and object distinction, first of
Hmm.
all, for the purposes of the argument. So the metaphysics of comprehension is that whatever the object is, whatever the other is, small o, can be comprehended by that subject, classified, described, and so on. And I like the word that Eaglestone uses for the section is omnivorous philosophy. Okay, so when you are comprehending, grasping something, you are, metaphorically speaking, ingesting it and understanding it.
Hmm.
Okay. However, in doing that, you are negating the otherness of that object or existent. And, as Levinas says, philosophy is an egoology. It is for me, it is for the I as the subject, not necessarily the person.
Hmm.
And it's a philosophy of power because, as he said, thematization, conceptualization of the other, we can describe it, we can grasp it, we can put it into its box, and
Hmm.
suppression or possessing of the other. So let's shift gears a minute. Let's think in terms of race. Okay. I can classify other people as belonging to a certain race. And that race has a certain characteristic or characteristics to it, behaviors, and so on. So classification of the other, of a different skin color, using racial categories.
Hmm.
Okay. But we know where this leads when you degenerate into outright racism, or maybe
Mm.
just skirting about a racial categorization of the other.
Yeah.
Okay, make sense now?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, and even from actually, yeah, it's funny that you mention race because that's actually one of the first subjects that I was kind of debating about with James Sullivan, who connected us in the first place when he got me more interested in postmodernism because I was really skeptical about it at first and kind of just bought this like Jordan Peterson conception of it without really looking into it.
right.
And James had written an article on the Mixed Mental Arts website. It was called something like Jordan Peterson doesn't understand the relevant philosophy.
Hmm.
And he he offered to talk to anyone through his email at the end of that, and I talked to him and we were debating back and forth, and he got me interested in postmodernism in the first place. And one of the I think it might have even been the very first subject that we talked about in that context was race, because I kept arguing, no, there are really different races that are always totally distinguishable,
Hmm.
classifiable races. And he was arguing like basically from the perspective of postmodernism, and talking about essays of Derrida and stuff like that, showing that, yeah, but these racial distinctions are so like they vary so much. There's so much individual variation, and there's so much variation depending on what type of white people we're talking about, what type of black people we're talking about, that sometimes a white person can look more like a black person, and a
Right.
black person can look more like a white person.
Right.
Yeah.
So the thing about race is, in Levinas's characterization, is an ontological category.
Yeah.
Okay. And so this is what his point is that Western philosophy is fundamentally an ontology,
Yeah, that makes sense.
particularly with ontological commitments. Races exist. Okay. So this is an ontology, and you commit to the fact of an existence of a race. Yes, there are races. Blacks, Asians, Caucasians, whatever it is, even with distinctions, but you're still committed to the ontology of race. The danger is when you commit to something like the ontology of race, it's all too easy for you to put one particular person, we'll say, and the other into a box, into a category. This is where the danger comes in.
And it can lead to things like eugenics.
It could lead to things like eugenics. It could lead to things like genocide. It could lead to all kinds of other things.
Yeah.
Okay. And there are many different ontologies that could be deployed here: race, gender, social class, economic status, whatever it
Yep.
is. So all these are ontologies or exercises in ontology. Okay. And what that does is that it is separating, putting at a distance what the other is.
Right.
Okay. Even calling the other a human being is kind of an ontological commitment.
Yeah, that's true.
You acknowledge that this other is a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. That's a whole different subject.
Yeah.
But I like this omnivorous philosophy. By deploying these ontological categories, you are now taking it egotistically as part of yourself,
Mm-hmm.
understanding, knowing. This is what Levinas is getting at.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
it's like I think we might have talked about this before, but it's like how, yeah, I think we did, but it's like how even if you compare all human beings to trees or so many other different types of species, we still have like 97% the same DNA or something like that.
Right. But DNA is a ontology too.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's see. Continuing on. Okay, let me see here. Yeah, so going back to one of the later points is that with the metaphysics of comprehension, there is the absolute freedom for the I, but not for the other.
So wait, I just thought of something that that I think Shane might say as a criticism that might be really easy to make. So if the ethics is supposed to be against the metaphysics of comprehension,
Hmm.
how does that not mean that, and I'm just saying, I'm just kind of like kind of steel manning here. How does
Hmm.
that not mean that postmodernists are deliberately trying to be incomprehensible?
That's a good question. Well, I guess I would be a careful reading of who, first of all, who would describe themselves as the postmodernist, or who classifies them as postmodern. Okay,
Yeah, usually other
I
people.
would not classify Levinas as postmodern at all. He is more firmly in the tradition, as I said, he was a contemporary of Heidegger.
Hmm.
Okay, so he's squarely within like the continental strain. He was French rather than German, and he was squarely in the phenomenological tradition. So he has a different take on this, definitely, than Heidegger does, by prioritizing ethics over ontology.
Hmm.
Okay, so with the earlier criticism, it is, are they deliberately trying to be incomprehensible? Yeah, maybe. I don't think deliberately in most cases. They're just, trying to stress the fact that the more that you try to classify or categorize, the less effective it is.
Right.
Because you're going to run into contradictions. You're going to, as we're looking at Levinas, you're going to thematize and conceptualize the other, where you put them in a box. And in some cases, that doesn't end well, putting others into boxes or objects into boxes. The earth is categorized as a certain way, as a potentially unlimited repository of natural resources, rather than, say, Gaia does, which is a living thing, or our environment that we have to protect, otherwise we perish.
Mm-hmm.
Now
Yeah.
we're following lots of different threads about what are the thematization and conceptualizations of this other. The earth could be
Yeah.
an other, could be a
Yeah.
radical other, the capital O, that is inscrutable
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah. And one of the major themes throughout Foucault's work is that, historically speaking, before the modern era, a lot of these classifications were totally different from the way that they became during the modern era.
Right. And also remember what we covered in the last essay, where but you'd seen this in Bauman, is that with postmodernism, it's a re-enchantment of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. That's like that.
Re-enchantment not necessarily being a good thing. The re-enchantment
Yeah.
is you're now dealing with ghosts, demons, spirits, things that cannot be easily classified or understood.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Okay.
like this this connection to romanticism that we talked about before. And
Right.
then also, like you mentioned Bauman again, he is one of many writers who in this vein talks about how the consequences of the postmodern condition and the postmodern era are often not good.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So continuing on. Next section, page 188, Western thought and otherness. Okay. So in the first paragraph, Eagleson is talking about their cracks, boundaries of Western thought. No surprise there. So Western thought should not be totally rejected per se, but it should be put into question through its encounter with otherness. It says, indeed, Levinas writes that this, quote, putting into question of the same by the other, capital O, is beyond knowledge, the condition of philosophy. It is not only attested by the articulations of Husserlian thought, meaning phenomenology, but also appears at the summits of philosophies. It is the beyond being of Plato. It is the entry through the door of the agent intellect in Aristotle. It is the idea of God in us, surpassing our capacity as finite beings. It is the exaltation of theoretical reasoning in Kant's practical reason. It is the study of the recognition of the other in Hegel himself. It is the renewal of duration in Bergson. It is the sobering of lucid reason in Heidegger. End quote. Okay, so philosophy, in Levinas's term, is putting into question beyond knowledge. That's the condition, the same by the other. So acknowledging the radical distinction of the other, putting everything else into question about the metaphysics of comprehension.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. So continuing. Okay. So Eagleston continues. This means that there are two kinds of other. One, the other that is within the system of same other, a dichotomy, whose otherness is really an inverted projection of the same. And two, the other that is outside and underlies the system. This structure is visible in, for example, the way Edward Said, who was a cultural critic, suggests that Western thought created a discourse of Orientalism through which it understood the inhabitants of the Middle East. Regardless of their otherness, they were, in the eyes of the West, at least, transformed into exemplars of the opposite of, quote, Western virtues. Yet it was the very existence of non-Western peoples that made the West the West. It can also be seen in Hélène Cixous's essay Sottises, which shows how the binary oppositions, such as man, woman, father, mother, day, night, leave unthinkable and unthought the existence of a woman. Okay, a couple different points here. So one of Said's famous book is called Orientalism, and this was charting the history of the notion of the Orient or the Middle East in particular. And what Eaglestone is saying here is that the Middle East or Middle Easterners were propped up as a exotic other to the West. Okay. However, the thing here is that the West became the West by setting itself up in opposition or distinction from the Middle East. Okay. So that's an important concept to understand. We in the West, well, what's the West? Okay, and you can run through an entire list of what makes up the West or the Western culture. But for a long, long time, the West has also defined itself against another.
Yep, definitely.
Particularly something that is seen as barbaric, as backward, as mysterious, incomprehensible, exotic. Many different terms you could apply here.
You definitely see that very strongly still today, like in the modern political landscape in particular, like attitudes towards the Middle East is exactly what you described. Like the Middle East in particular, like that it's barbaric and backwards.
Right. Or even a religion, Islam. Islam is, to use Sam Harris's descriptions, is a pestilence that needs to be wiped out.
Or the motherlode of bad ideas.
The motherlode of bad ideas. Yes, correct. Okay. So that's nothing new. Islam has been a threat to the West since Muhammad roamed the earth in the 7th century.
Yeah. What do people think the Crusades were about, right?
Right. Right. They were defining themselves against the infidel, the enemy.
Yeah.
And then with Hélène Cixous, this is the radical binary oppositions of a woman is defined by a distinction with a man. A woman is a lesser man.
Oh yeah, for most of human history.
Right. So that's where we're coming from there.
Right.
Also, Derrida takes this up about the strict distinctions, the dualistic approaches of these things.
Right.
That's a separate issue.
And that's a big aspect of modern Western culture too.
Yes, binary oppositions. Okay, so Eaglestone continues in the next paragraph, quote, "Postmodernism begins when the mainstream of Western thought encounters otherness and does not, or tries not to, consume it, but instead responds to it, using the only language it can, its own, quote, Greek language. Thus, postmodernism begins in ethics, in a response to otherness, but it can only respond through precisely the language that denies otherness and attempts to fracture that language." Okay, so the reference to Greek is referring to the ancient Greeks, the language of philosophy, you could say, or of ethics that stem from Plato and Aristotle, you could say, which is a certain ethical approach.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That answers
Now,
the question I was going to ask.
right now, something to point out is that the Greeks, the term barbaros is a Greek barbarian comes from the Greek term barbaros, which refers to an foreigner or an outsider. And the Greeks were the pinnacles of civilization, so they thought at the time. And so others like the Persians, the radical other, barbaros, or those in continental Europe that they really didn't know so much about the barbaros, And going back to the earlier point, this is how the Greeks defined themselves in relation to the barbaros. So this thing about ethics is, now that ontology breaks down because of the other, because we know where we trip up in using ontology to try to grasp or consume the other, ethics is the approach that we take now. However, ethics is burdened with baggage from centuries ago in its response to the other that still denies the otherness of the other. Okay? Making sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So Eaglestone continues. Who are these others? In one way, they are personal others, other existents. But perhaps more importantly, the others whom Western thought encounters are those with other socio-cultural ways of thinking or existing in the world. These could be internal to Europe, for example, women, Jewish, Roma, Sinti, any who do not, for whatever reason, possess, as for Levinas. Possession is preeminently the form in which the other becomes the same, by becoming mine. Or external, through the experiences of trade or colonialism. And this is not meant to suggest either that Western thought is totally monolithic. It is itself made up of mixtures. Important point. Different
Mhm.
voices, reflections on encounters, things added by chance or on purpose, a combination of rational and religious traditions. All too often, however, especially when it has been, quote, successful, it denies these voices and is dominated by the metaphysics of comprehension. The same metaphysics, the same urge, underlies the desire for colonial and economic expansion, the oppression of peoples, the development of technoscience, medicines, aeroplanes, pushing back scientific boundaries, and the resolution of conflicting claims by putting them into the same language, if possible. The point is not that the urge is to be destroyed, which would amount not to the deconstruction of the West, but to the destruction of the West, but that it needs to be reflected on, allowed to go only where it should, its side effects scrupulously watched and reported on.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Oh, that's an interesting point, and I like that point about how this attitude can lead to like colonialism too, and the like you see that in that sort of thing in the world today too. Like we've got to spread Western democracy everywhere.
We have
Those
to
other
civilize these people.
Yeah, we got to civilize them so that we can make them their lives better because
Right,
we're the best.
right. And this, as Eagleston points out, dominated by the metaphysics of comprehension.
Yeah.
Okay. The urge to make the other the same as myself.
Yes.
However, what's often ignored, and this is what the point of postmodernism is to also be aware that there are others within. This is what the internal and the external others. You know, the perfect example here, the internal others into Europe are the Jews, how they've been treated, the Roma, the Gypsies. You know, the Gypsies are kind of a radical other because they don't fit in to any of the categories of Europe. Okay,
Yeah.
this is an internal other, but also within Europe there are others: French versus Germans versus Spanish versus English. It's not consistent across the board. They can call themselves European, but European is kind of that grab bag concept that lots of things can fall into there.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so then the point of this is to just step back and respond to instead of classify or take in to absorb.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
This is a big theme in postmodernism that this urge to classify things.
Well, the urge not to classify. This
Yeah,
is
that's
to
what I mean. I
this is
meant to
this is to
say,
highlight the urge in Western philosophy of classification
yeah,
and trying to possess.
yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, I
Okay.
misspoke. Yeah.
All right. So continuing on, page 190, Eagleston says, one very extreme example of the metaphysics of comprehension is the working of the totalitarian states in the 20th century. Aha, very good one. And then he mentions Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Excellent book. I highly recommend you read it. But we won't get into that here. Okay. So that's one example of metaphysics of comprehension, totalization. Bauman also touched on this too,
Hmm.
with the relentless march of modernization.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the next section on the following page, science, scientism, and postmodernism. Okay. The metaphysics of comprehension can also be seen in scientism. Okay, so scientism is, Andrew, how would you define scientism?
It's the like the urge to apply science to everything to the point that you can make arguments about things that sound scientific, but they're really not. Like, it can lead to pseudoscience, or of course, the example we've used before is Sam Harris claiming that science can give us objective moral values and that sort of thing.
Right. It's almost a fetishization of science.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's scientism, metaphysics of comprehension. And then he says, I would suggest, however, that much of the philosophy of post-structuralism, not postmodernism, post-structuralism, is precisely about science, not perhaps in its everyday form, but in terms of its scope and ambition. If the post in post-structuralism begins with the deconstruction of Saussure's project, a science which studies the role of signs, by bringing to the fore the unquestioned axioms at its center and the logic that follows from them, then the question of science has been the heart of the postmodern project. Okay, so you remember a long time ago I had mentioned making a distinction between postmodernism and post-structuralism.
Mm-hmm.
I think definitely historically speaking, and this is where you bring in Derrida and Foucault, it's more proper to use the term post-structuralist instead of postmodern right there, because
Okay.
they grew up in and they were critical of the structuralist approach, the structuralist movement that took root in France, or was predominant in France, throughout the early and the mid 20th century.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, structuralism is attempting to get down to the bedrock structures of language, society, science, whatever it could be,
Okay.
almost making it a science. But that's not the case here.
That sounds like a very subtle distinction to me.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Because structuralism was shown to be contradictory, because particularly as Derrida liked to do, tweezing out where the contradictions lie in the
Right.
structure. Already it's baked into the cake, more or less, the contradictions.
Yeah.
Okay? So then Eaglestone continues, once the system, science in this case, has comprehended everything on its own terms, then there is nothing more, no otherness. Okay? Make
Okay.
sense?
Once the system has comprehended everything on its own terms, then there's nothing more, no otherness.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense because it's totally classified.
Right. So if you're using the language of science, no science in this case, to classify everything, where's the mystery? Where's the other?
Yeah.
That's there. I mean, if you're trying to describe, shall we say consciousness, that's probably a classic example in philosophy of mind. Some people have tried to explain consciousness in scientific terms. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do that, what are you doing? Really? You're reducing it to brain states.
Yes.
So there's no otherness. But now, as philosophers of mind have run into, is that they really don't know what the hell consciousness is.
Yeah.
So consciousness now has retained its status as a radical other. Science fails to comprehend exactly what consciousness is. And that's not to say that philosophy understands what it is either.
Yeah.
It's inscrutable,
Yeah, for sure.
really. Okay, so that is that section. Then moving on, page 192. Levinas's analysis of the omnivorous philosophy that underlies Western thought is one way of showing how the ethical response to the events of the past and present underlines postmodernism. I would suggest that, without the need to take on board more of Levinas's thought, analogous structures are visible in the thought of other figures. Deleuze and Guattari, opposed to Levinas in many ways, are participants in what might be described as the advent of a postmodern ethics. Quote, poised in the light of the dissolution of both the rational, judging subject and the contract-based, liberal accounts of the individual's allegiance to the social community. Here both, quote, rational, judging subject and the contract-based community partake of the metaphysics of comprehension that reduces otherness to a third term established by that same metaphysics, and its dissolution, if too hopeful, certainly causes a disruption. Foucault can be seen to be showing, perhaps in broad strokes, the ways in which Western thought turned forms of otherness, which it would now call madness, homosexuality, criminality, into third terms, madness, homosexuality, criminality, without quotes, and so stripped their otherness from them and incorporated them within the system of itself. It can also be seen perhaps at an angle in the work of Adorno. He writes aphoristically that dialectical thought, quote, is an attempt to break through the coercion of logic by its own means. But since it must use these means, it is at every moment in danger of itself acquiring a coercive character. The ruse of reason would like to hold sway over the dialectic too. Following Benjamin, Adorno argues that the obligation is to, quote, think at the same time dialectically and undialectically, that it is necessary to use reason and not to use it simultaneously. Okay. So the point here is...
that reminds me of the point about that Levinas made about omnivorous philosophy.
Right. So what Eaglestone is getting at here is that we should try to move away from the omnivorous philosophy, using Levinas's terms.
Okay.
We should get away from prioritizing ontology over anything else, also Levinas's point. Because we're now dealing with the other, really the only way to deal with the other or to engage with the other is through ethics. But the distinction here is don't use the same approach, the same terms as ethics, in ethics, as Western philosophy has been doing, which is itself part of the metaphysics of comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In particular, when you're stressing something like duty and obligation, that's kind of a calculus, and that's Kant's approach to ethics, duty and obligation.
Mm-hmm.
But that's already circumscribing the other into a subject that is bound by duty and obligation, as I am bound by duty and obligation.
Yeah, it's the same as like Socrates or any of the Stoic philosophers talking about the importance of virtue and that sort of thing.
Right. So, also we've seen in our own lives is that not everybody lives their life according to virtue.
No.
Okay. Yet we ascribe virtue to everybody. Now,
yeah.
When you kind of go through this stuff and you let it sit with you, it kind of makes sense because in the many others that you've encountered in your life, some of them will react more or less the same way that you do.
Mm-hmm.
But there are many others who maybe at best meet you halfway, or at the very worst, they don't do what you think they should do.
Right.
When that happens, you've now encountered the other.
Right.
Almost as a radical and distinct other from you.
Right.
I mean, think about little kids. Little kids are going to do what little kids are going to do. You tell them, sit down. They get up and they jump around. You tell them, don't run into the street. They run into the street. Okay. You're dealing with a radical other there.
Yeah. Or
all right.
Or like what I saw when I was tutoring earlier today, and my tutoring student's mom said, don't bounce the basketball in the house, but then he bounced the basketball in the house.
Right. We know this all too well.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So then Eaglestone continues, last paragraph. It is true that this ethics, the disruption of Western thought through Western thought based on a more primordial response to the other, is, as Derrida points out, quote, an ethics without law and without concept, which maintains its nonviolent purity only before being determined as concepts and laws. Let me read that again. An ethics without law and without concept, which maintains its nonviolent purity only before being determined as concepts and laws.
Okay. So it maintains like you said, an ethics without law and without concept.
Right.
It maintains its nonviolent purity only before being determined as concepts and laws. So it sounds like Derrida is saying there, as soon as we classify these laws and concepts, then they become violent instead of nonviolent.
Right. That's a way of looking at it. The first part of the sentence is, in many ethical systems, and I do stress system, there are certain concepts of what fairness is, for example, or justice is, or retribution, or reciprocity, many different ethical terms that have an ethical import to them. That's conceptualization. And then you have a law, possibly, applied to that. Ethical systems, like you're working in a particular company and their code of ethics, okay? Lawyers put that together. So law is already involved in it. If
Yeah.
you fail to uphold the code of ethics, if you violate the code of ethics, there's going to be hell to pay, a punishment.
Yeah.
So that is a violent, you could say, reaction to violating the code of ethics. But the very fact that there are concepts of what justice is, what virtue is, and so on, and laws to back this up, already commits a sort of violence against the other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I like the distinction there too, because like it seems like he's saying in the first part of the quote that like it doesn't mean this sort of misconception about postmodernism that it means, okay, so just everything is relative and we shouldn't have anything resembling a law or concept or something like that. It seems to me more to be making the point that we can still have these things that are like at least similar to laws and concepts, but as soon as we have them like clearly defined and not allowed to be changed, that's where they can become a problem. Does that
Right.
sound right?
Right. It's also remember the categorization of who the other is. So if you
Yeah.
and I are operating a certain code of ethics, okay, let's use an easy example like the Code of Hammurabi, which that's where eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth comes from.
Hmm.
Okay. So
Is
if
that
you do it,
Mesopotamian or something like that?
yeah,
Okay.
Mesopotamia.
Okay.
So that's definitely a, shall we say, extreme violent code of ethics. You do something to me that injures me, and I can exact retribution on you within a certain measure. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth doesn't mean that if you steal something, I can kill you.
Yeah.
That's not what that means. It is proportional to whatever the offense was.
So if you steal something from me, I can steal something from you.
Right. Eye for an eye. Or,
Okay.
if you kill a family member, then I can kill one of your family members. Eye
Right.
for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Now, is that the best ethical system that exists? Probably not. We got away from that centuries ago.
Hmm.
But the very fact that we live within the code of ethics, if I accept this, then I am imposing it upon you. But now you now are an object or not an object, but you are now other that is more comprehensible to me, metaphysics of comprehension. And that's
Hmm.
somebody that I expect is going to behave a certain way.
Right.
Whereas you are not the other primordially.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I
So
see that, like I said, it's almost like I personally am trying to like challenge categories in my own personality in some ways because I definitely could be identified as a nerd. I
mm,
definitely could also be identified as a jock in some ways,
mhm,
and I definitely could be identified as a hippie in some ways too. But I
mm,
consider myself to be in all three of those categories.
yes. And you're just an Andrew. You're a category
Yes,
unto yourself.
yes.
Okay. So Eaglestone continues. It could not become a law or a series of moral axioms, as this would at once mean that it was complicit with, rather than interrupting, the metaphysics of comprehension, and would become blind to some others. This is why many postmodern thinkers and writers continue to use vague terms such as openness or fracture. The specificity of, say, an axiom would immediately betray the ethical intention. But by the same token, it cannot be forever free floating, since first we live in a world, and for Levinas, Our subjectivity arises from our ethical responsibilities in it. Interesting point. Second, there are obvious ethical needs. And third, in order to respond, it is necessary to do so through recognition and reorganization of older thoughts and moments of culture. Thus, the ethical interruption must become, but cannot be, codified in a politics, a morality, a position, an identity. But this must also always be ready to interrupt itself again in the name of the obligations to which it responds. The ethics of postmodernity is not an ethics of freedom. For Levinas, for postmodernists, we can never be free from obligations and from responsibility.
Oh, that's a great point.
Okay, you know,
Yeah.
the tricky part, the sticky part about this is, as you just said, we can never be free from obligations and from responsibility.
Mhm.
These are, I'm thinking of a good book by Alfonso Linguist called The Imperative. There are imperatives that are operating in the world always.
Mhm.
We have obligations as a responsibility. We must respond to these imperatives. We must respond to the others that we encounter within the world. But when we start codifying systems of ethics and expecting that everybody adhere to that, we have some difficulties and maybe even more serious problems down the road if we hold them to the code too strictly.
Yeah. That's why I like that term openness, because it's like it's an ethical system, but it's not a rigid ethical system. Like, it's an ethical system that's always open to change and uh, wary of becoming too clearly defined.
Right. Because you and I have read enough philosophy where we know that any kind of a system, any kind of a description, doesn't fit everything that exists within the world.
Yeah.
However, as is the case with language, we really cannot get by in the world without language, even though we know that language has some severe limitations
Yeah.
and it is a source of endless confusion and frustration and misunderstanding.
Hmm. For
Same thing
sure.
with the code of ethics. Even though we know that we have obligations, we have a responsibility.
And I like it, particularly that word responsibility, I think is important too, because it's interesting because another uh, a big aspect of Jordan Peterson's ethics is responsibility, and he has a huge problem with postmodernists. But
Mhm.
specifically, explicitly, there, the they were saying that no, there still is responsibility within this ethical system. It's not that you should just throw away, like we said earlier, it's not that you should throw away responsibility or law or concepts. It's that they should be more loosely defined and open to change.
Right. Now let's go to our old friend Peterson here. One very trenchant criticism I've heard against him is that probably one of his main motivations of what he does is that he is terrified of totalitarianism.
Oh yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. Because what was he working on earlier in his career?
The Soviet Union and
Soviet Union
communism.
and communists, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's now clear that identifying postmodernists with the cultural Marxists, neo-Marxists, we're not even going to go into that. It's too late for that. These boogeymen is that anything really that smacks of that can't be really put into a neat little box inevitably leads down the road to totalitarianism.
Right.
Okay,
Which is
but
postmodernism is almost arguing the opposite of that.
right, because we saw earlier in the essay with Eagleston is that Levinas, or rather, what did he say here? What is it? Scientism. One very extreme example of the metaphysics of comprehension is in the working of the totalitarian states in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I
it
read to that
reminds me.
is
Oh, sorry.
being terrified of postmodernists because you think that they're going to lead to totalitarianism. Your fear or you trying to contain that is going to achieve the opposite goal.
Yeah, definitely. And it also it reminds me too, again, of what Bauman said about communism, which is that it's modernism on steroids.
Right. One very, very good metaphor he used in Modernity and Ambivalence is modernity is like gardening. Okay, what does the gardener do? The gardener is tending to the garden and he's pulling out weeds.
Hmm.
Okay. Weeds, you know, you spend some time in a garden or you're working with vegetables or whatever it is, you're going to get weeds. So you have to go weeding. And the gardener is trying to eliminate weeds. And you could use Roundup or whatever it is, some kind of chemical to try to get rid of the weeds permanently so you never have to weed them. But you're going to have some unintended consequences when you use that chemical. Okay.
Hmm.
So him using that metaphor is in the case of like the Soviet Union, where it tries to rationalize everything, modernizing on steroids, yes,
Hmm.
really engendered some serious um, unintended consequences, such as environmental degradation and things like the KGB, the secret police.
Hmm.
Okay.
And gulags.
And gulags. Yep. These were all hallmarks of that kind of modernization.
Hmm.
So that's one example of modernity, postmodernity. But in this case, with ethics, is we have to be careful in using ethics. And remember a point that I made earlier is that the way I understood it from years ago is that the word ethics always conjures in my mind systems and rules,
Yeah.
but morality could be something slightly different. It doesn't mean that there isn't rules or customs that exist within morality, but morality, I think, has more of that openness to it than ethics does.
Okay.
That's just my opinion.
So it sounds like, would you say then that the postmodern ethics system is more of a moral system based on your interpretation then?
Could be,
Okay.
could be. That's a whole different kettle of fish.
Yeah.
Of how does a postmodern writer define what a postmodern ethics is?
Yeah.
The point is that the postmodern ethics approach acknowledges obligations, responsibility, but yet retains that open.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
If that makes sense.
Oh, you cut off there for a minute for me.
That the postmodern ethics is trying to retain the otherness in the other by stepping back, refraining from consuming, if you will, the other.
Yeah. No, this whole idea also reminds me of something that Hunter Motz and Brian Callen have talked about on mixed mental arts. I forget who it was, but they were talking to a physicist about this idea of a theory of everything, a
Hmm.
theory that can explain literally how everything works in the universe.
Right,
If that were to happen, there would be no otherness.
right. We saw that earlier in the essay.
Yeah,
That's what scientism is trying to do.
yeah,
Coming up with a theory
exactly.
of everything or using the language of science as the priority language to describe everything in
Yeah,
scientific terms. Well, again, if you do that with some kind of a totalizing system, then you're just negating otherness.
yeah,
Because we'll take it in terms and we'll use like human beings. I can describe you as just a collection of chemicals and predetermined subatomic particles working together.
mhm,
But where's you? Where's Andrew, the person? I've just
No way.
completely written that out, obliterated it.
Mm-hmm. It's like the example of consciousness that you mentioned earlier. If it's just brain states, then
Hmm.
there's no more otherness.
Right.
Yeah.
And therein lies the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the end of the essay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, as usual, that helps me going through it helps me understand it a lot better. I like that now that I understand it better.
Right.
And then also, as usual, you basically covered already the sections that I had highlighted in my notes for that one too.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's good. I like that because yeah, I like that whole idea of how of just you know, there can be concepts and laws, and there can be responsibility and everything like that, but it should if it's a good idea for it to be like these terms to be loosely defined and open to change. It doesn't mean that literally this thing actually means something else, and it could mean anything. It could
Hmm.
mean that these things, uh, like I'm thinking of Foucault again too. He talks about how these concepts change throughout history. Like they're going to change whether you want them to or not.
Hmm.
So just being resistant to change seems like resistant to progress almost in a way.
Yeah. Also, resistance is a choice.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. So that's all I got.
All right. Yeah, this was a slightly shorter one than usual. I think
Yeah.
maybe my comprehension is getting better so that I can understand the ethics against the metaphysics of comprehension.
Yeah. So since we've done this, I think next time we should also cover the law and justice in postmodernity. That's a logical extension of this because when you define the terms for dealing with an ethics, then law and justice follow. Because
That's true.
we had covered this in our discussion. Is that, well, what does this mean now for something like law? And if within a certain ethical system you define justice a certain way, then how does one define justice really?
Hmm.
Okay, so we can save that for next time.
Yeah. All right. Well, um, I will just say all the stuff that I like to say at the end of my videos. So, thanks everyone so much for watching. Hope this helped you to comprehend postmodern ethics better. It certainly helped me a lot, like I said, and it's an ethical system that makes sense to me. And also, that's a crucial thing that I learned that there actually is, or could at least be, could at least be considered to be an ethical system in postmodernism. Because I myself have told people before that there is no ethical system in postmodernism, but now I understand that there is, and I can explain it, or at least make an effort of explaining it in the future. But yeah, anyway, thanks also to those of you who share this video, and to those of you who subscribe to my channel, and especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. I always really appreciate that, and I'll add the link for that in the description of this video. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right, keep having mindgasms, everyone. And any clever last words there, Tim?
Yes, I'm tired. I'm going to sleep.
Okay. Maintain your otherness.
Maintain my otherness in my
Yes.
dreams. In
Yes.
your dreams.
All right. All right. Thanks, everyone. And adios until next time.